Right, hello Year 13. Just a very short video here. Just going to give you a few tips for finding primary sources to use in your NEA coursework, okay? So I'm not going to talk through the mark scheme and things too much here. This is just going to be a couple of pointers about some ideas about where you could go to find good quality sources with enough background on their provenance to be able to do a good analysis, okay? So we saw last time that for your NEA, you have to include at least 3 sources of 2 different types, okay? So it could be newspaper, diary, etc., but you've got to have at least 2 different types and 3 as a minimum, okay? You've then got to have a range of relevant and well-supported comments on the value of those sources, okay? And you've got to be able to show knowledge of the context to analyze what they're saying. You've got to be able to think about the context in which they're written, the purpose they're written for, and how that affects its usefulness. Another key thing for thinking about when you're searching for sources, you have to give a balanced and convincing judgment on the merits of the source in relation to the topic under investigation. So what that means is you have to think very carefully about which sources you use, because you are not just picking any old random source just about the civil rights movement. You're trying to think about ones which have a real value for answering the specific question that you're answering, okay? And so think very carefully about which sources you pick and what points you're trying to illustrate by using them. That's really, really important, okay? So remember to think carefully about what your question is before you start searching for sources. Now, just a few quick tips about places you can go to find sources, okay? Now, one to start off with is the Yale Open Lecture series, which we've looked at before, okay? Now, with the Yale Open Lecture series, it's accompanied by a source anthology, which is this book, Let Nobody Turn Us Around, which we'll have digitized very shortly, which you can find things from. And what's really good is I'll just show you on the lecture series. So if we go into African American history on that one, if you go into any of the sessions, okay, so obviously he's done it chronologically. If, for example, you're looking at from sit-ins to civil rights, okay, he's got page references for that anthology, and these are always primary sources, okay? So all of these ones that are referenced, I'm going to digitize as soon as I've got the book. So that's a really, really good place to go, okay? So just go into any of those lectures. If, for example, you're like, I'd like to find a primary source on Reconstruction, you could do worse as a starting point than go into the 2 Reconstruction lectures, look at the page numbers that you're expected to find for that, and you could look at that source and see if it's relevant to the question that you're doing or the point you're trying to make. Okay, so that's one thing I'd say to start off with. Right, a second tip, and this is one that we use in history teaching all the time, is Spartacus Educational. So now Spartacus Educational is a really cool website because it's designed for history teachers, which means that it's got a lot of sources, and also importantly, it will often give you a bit of background on the source as well, okay, in terms of when it was written, why, etc., and which makes it very useful. And to find Spartacus Educational ones, all you have to do pretty straightforwardly, just type in Spartacus Educational and then whatever the person or topic you're looking for, and quite often you get lucky. So let's say IDB Wells if you're doing, say, Black leadership. So if I go into that, right, Spartacus Educational, IDB Wells. Okay, so I get my sort of Wikipedia style article about her, which is really excellent. But then what's really good at the end of any Spartacus Educational is they always have a list of primary sources, okay? So you'll find out, you know, when this was taken from. You can always do a bit of Googling on the publication if there's not much there. But there's always a bunch of primary sources afterwards where you'll have the year, and then sometimes you get a little bit about the context as well, which is really, really handy. So that's a really cool one to use. So anytime you want to find a topic, just do Spartacus Educational and then whatever the thing is. So if you're doing white resistance, you might want to do white citizens councils. And then you get an article about Asa Al Carter, who was one of the leaders of the Alabama Citizens Council that tried to block desegregation of schools, etc. So it could be a good example of that. And if we go down, and again, because it's always at the bottom you need to go to, you get a bunch of really good primary sources, nice and detailed, and also with some background on the times and on the context in which that source was made. Okay, so that's a really good one. Okay, Spartacus Educational. Also books. Okay, so now remember, we did talk about this briefly last time. whenever you're reading a book, if you read a reference to a source, okay, so it could be a quote from a letter or a speech or whatever, you find the footnote, you go to the back, you can find out where the quote or whatever is taken from. So the books you've been reading are really, really useful for finding primary sources as well. Just a note of caution, remember that obviously sometimes historians will reference other historians' works, okay? So for example, on here, we can see, right, there's one reference to Sir Thomas Sowell, who's a African-American historian writing a book called Educational Assumptions versus History. That's obviously not a primary source, that's another interpretation that they're using to back up their point. But then you can also see that there are actually primary sources here. So you've got Booker T. Washington from a newspaper article, a statement in the Philadelphia, North America. So you could Google that and find the original copy as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You can use the footnotes. And if you want to find out more detail, quite often if you just Google in the footnote, you might be able to find the original document with a bit more about it, okay? So the footnotes of books are really, really useful as well. Another thing as well, you obviously can use Google and Wikipedia as well, but I would say with that, just be careful that, remember, you've got to know enough about the provenance of the source in terms of when it was made, why, etc., to be able to write a really good analysis of it. So you can use Google to find primary sources, but be wary that you need to know enough about the origins. It's really frustrating when students find a good source on, say, Google Images, but then they actually can't find anything about the origin of when it was made, who, where, why. So you've got to make sure that when you find a source just using that you are actually able to find out the exact origins of it. One thing just to note as well is, just like with the reading we were doing just then, if you just say want to Google someone like, say, W.E.B. Du Bois, remember as well on Wikipedia that they also use footnotes, okay? So again, quite a lot of the time with Wikipedia articles, the references are to other historians and secondary literature. But sometimes if you go to the footnotes, you'll be able to find some primary sources as well. And then again, what you might want to do if you find one is just copy and paste it into Google, and you'll be able to find out more about that one. But again, Wikipedia can be hit and miss. It really depends on what issue you're researching, okay? Final thing as well, remember that as well as those 5, so the Yale Open Lecture series in conjunction with that book, Spartacus Education, which I think is the easiest and best one, using the notes and footnotes, and then Google Wikipedia. If you really get stuck and you really want to try and find a source on a particular topic, or you're really not getting anywhere, just ask myself or your other teacher, and then that'll be absolutely fine, okay? So you can always use your teachers to find sources if you're really struggling, because they'll have slightly better research skills than you, okay? So I hope that was useful, okay? Remember those 5. If you don't remember them, maybe pause quickly now and you can jot those down. But those would be my 5 best places to find primary sources for doing the NEA.